I am Sharda, a lawyer working with the Laws of Social Reproduction project at King's College London in IWH. We are thrilled to be hosting Dr. Sirisha Naidu, who will be speaking to us about class and social reproduction, interrogating time use data for clues. And today's talk will build on the time use survey conducted in India in 2019. And Dr. Naidu will be examining the limits and possibilities of using such data to enrich feminist political economy analysis of agrarian change. And I'm sure most of us are already familiar with Dr. Naidu's work. And for those of our friends who aren't, Dr. Naidu is an associate professor of economics and an affiliate faculty in the Race, Ethnicity, and Gender Studies Department at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She is also a research associate at the Asian Political Economy at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And she is currently serving on the steering committee of the Union of Radical Political Economists. And before I just give the floor to Dr. Naidu, we will be taking questions in the second half of the conversation. If you want, you can add your questions either in the chat box or you can raise your hand. So yeah, without taking any more of anybody's time, I would like to invite Dr. Naidu to start the discussion.
Okay, so I have shared my slide, and I hope everyone can see that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So this work, interrogating time use data for clues on class and social reproduction, is work that I am conducting with my friend and colleague Smriti Rao from Assumption University. And essentially, the motivation for this work comes from sort of agrarian studies literature, particularly where in the Marxian literature, classes in the Indian context, class has primarily been used in the in terms of or inferred in terms of household land holding and primary source of income for lack of good data on actual social relations of production. And there have been a lot of critiques of this sort of inference or inferring of class from just landholding and primary source of income. And beyond that, there have been others, of course, who have talked about, going beyond, talking about classes of labor and, talking about formal subsumption, which Smriti herself has written about, surplus labor approaches, and people like Carmen Diandier have talked about, going beyond just talking about class at the household level, but perhaps also thinking about individuals' principal occupation, etc. So this sort of forms sort of the motivation for the work that we want to do, or this project of trying to uncover class and all of the class processes within the Indian economy. And we're really building on the long-standing feminist project of visibilizing work and workers that have been ignored by Marxist and feminist economists, whether that is talking about informal work, whether that's talking about sex work and so on. Not that we are talking about sex work in this particular piece, but that, we're drawing from that. And we want to talk about, the political significance of exploring these overlapping social relations more fully. So when we talk about the classes of labor, or what Isa Shivji, borrowing from Walter Rodney's use of the term working people, talks about the toiling people. So when we talk about these different heterogeneities that exist within the working people, what are the modes of, or what are the points under which people can come together in terms of contingent solidarities? At what point can this, can we think about both from an analytical point of view, but also from a political point of view? What is it that brings working people together in order to sort of perhaps engage in social transformation? And then also for us as researchers, when we think about policy making, et cetera, what are those points of commonalities, and what are those points of challenge? We also want to make a case for more widespread use of time use data and political economy analyses, which I want to talk about at this point. in terms of the framework, we're really using feminist political or feminist radical political economy framework, talking about interconstitutive analyses of class and gender relations, but not divorced in the Indian context from understanding caste. Because how else do we understand labor if not talking about labor and work, if we don't talk about all of these three axes, not just as axes of identity, but also axes that actually transform social relations of production, and also how we understand work, who gets who engages in work that's considered productive, who engages in work that's considered reproductive, and so on, and all of the fantastic work that people have been engaged in, and particularly feminist economists. So we understand reproduction alongside production as being central or important um, to a political economy analysis. And in doing so, we want to bring in three sets of literatures: the literature on class and labor, and of course, a lot of work done on that. The literature on time use, again, in the Indian context, we've had only one pilot study in 1999. And so this is sort of this national time use survey is a first in India. And then the literature on social reproduction, again, some, going back to, 1970s, but of course, there's also a much longer history of that, and some very interesting, fascinating work more recently. And even though I've kind of, demarcated some of this literatures, actually, some of it is very overlapping. I don't mean to claim that, one, a particular work belongs in one class and not the other, or one category and not another. So we understand, social reproduction as reproductive labor that absorb the cost of production and contribute to surplus extraction, but also that it's not just engaged in reproduction of labor, but the reproduction of all those marginally attached to capital. And in doing so, we also have a critique of the official statistics, the National Sample Survey data, and it's not sort of critique that we, we are presenting necessarily. This is work that others have, of course, presented, in any case, the critique is that they have a limited view of work that excludes reproductive labor. And our question is, to what extent does the Indian Time Use Survey, the recent Indian Time Use Survey, allow us to address this gap and try to understand these overlapping constitutive social relations in which we can, or to what extent are we able to gender class or class gender and integrate caste in our analysis, and to what extent does the Time Use Survey allow for this? So in talking about gendering class and classing gender, of course, in terms of classing gender, sort of some of the more mainstream literature has typically used the marginal per capita, or the marginal per capita consumption expenditure as a proxy for income, and try to infer, sort of, or use a more Weberian notion of class to infer, how is gender or gendered labor different across these income or consumption categories. And we don't think that's sufficient. We want to try and use a little more, like a more sort of Marxian analysis of that. And in terms of gendering class, of course, there has been some, but not very much work on that. Again, from the agrarian studies literature. And again, we want to integrate caste into both, again, because we think it's important in terms of understanding labor. The one thing we do not do is incorporate the role of generational and spatial relations, which we think are important, but I'm not going to present. And we haven't actually explored that fully yet. The Indian Time Use Survey, I imagine everyone is, or somewhat familiar with it, based on 24 hours recall period, and uses the classification of activity follows the International Classification of Activities for Time Use Statistics. Like I said, the upside is it does not restrict data to conventional economic measures. And so it allows for a more expansive understanding of work, production, and reproduction. There are, of course, a lot of limitations of the Indian Time Use Survey. And I know that in this forum, this seminar series, there's been, a session on that. So one get into that. So given all of these limitations, our analysis is restricted to rural working age individuals. And of all of the categories that the Indian Time Use Survey collects data on in terms of time use, we sort of are focused on 4 categories of activities, one being employment and related activities. And this is typically what is, or what has showed up in previous, data, and particularly NSSO data or the official statistics. In addition, we are also interested in production of goods for own final use, unpaid domestic services for household members, which include cooking, cleaning, and activities of that nature, and unpaid caregiving services for household members, which includes childcare, elder care, care of other individuals in the household. So these are the 4 categories that we've restricted, or we've kind of focused on, and we're really interested in sort of uncovering. In terms of the class categories, we're not, sort of suggesting new class categories, definitely going beyond just land, but we're drawing really from Vamsi Vakulabaranam's work, in which he talks about both rural and urban classes. Because we're only focused on the rural, we talk about 6 different classes, which include both land holdings, but also principal occupation. If we were talking about the class as it's typically defined as a household, thinking about the household class category, then the household class category would be based on land holdings of the household and the principal occupation of the oldest working male in the household. And I'll talk a little bit, we then try and tweak that a little bit to talk about individual class categories in which we talk about land holdings and then the principal occupation of the individual. So, some data stuff, and I'm not presenting tables extensively. I do have them if you want to see them, but what we wanted to do was look at what is, the distinction, or is there any, are there any differences if we wanted to look at the inequities in the time spent in the 4 different activities of employment time, own goods production, unpaid domestic work, and unpaid care work. Are there any differences? Are there any inequities? And we used a particular kind of Gini decomposition, which allows us to decompose by household level, class, and gender, but it allows us to look at what are the inequities in time use of these categories between class and within class. So, between class, of course, we understand, this is, people have talked about it. But what we also find is that for both men and women, that there are some differences within class. In other words, that it's not, the amount of time spent on any of these activities is not sort of, there is some degree of difference, or there's some degree of inequality or inequity in terms of how people end up spending time. We see something very similar for when we engage in this Gini or find the Gini decomposition by household level, class, and caste as well. That of course, in this case, between castes, very low inequality in time spent in different activities for men, For women between caste groups, there is some differences in terms of employment and own goods production, but very low inequality in time spent on domestic work and care work. But within caste groups, there are significant differences in time across activities. What we, the point being that, caste, class, or gender by themselves do not sufficiently account for differences in time use of different workers. And so we want to try and see in what ways, if at all, the time use can allow us to get to a much more nuanced and a much more, sort of complex understanding of time use, time spent, labor, work, and eventually class. So the other problem associated with looking at household class status is that there's a very large proportion of women who get excluded. So this table, and I'm sorry, this is the first table of 5 tables. I promise not too many. So the table, the diagonal of in the table tells us something about. So we mapped household class categories to individual class categories. So like I said, in terms of individual class categories, it's based on household landholding and principal occupation of the individual as opposed to principal occupation of the oldest working male in the household. And the diagonal, which is in red, tells us that, for instance, agricultural wage households, only 35% of, and this table is only for women, so only 35% of women who are in agricultural wage households are actually engaged in agricultural wage. And similarly, if you look at the diagonal non-agricultural wage workers and for household and for individuals, only 9% of women classified 9% of women in non-agricultural wage households actually engage in agricultural wage. And if you look at, and similarly, the diagonal tells you that it doesn't actually map on, right? That correspondence doesn't exist to the extent that one would imagine or one hopes in order for easy analysis. And then the first column, which is also highlighted in red, tells us, that's the proportion of women in each of those households who don't have a class category or who don't fall into these 6 class categories, right? So, and in total, that's a very high proportion. That's 72% of the population who are not engaged in agricultural wage or non-agricultural wage, or are not small farmers, or not categorized as salaried workers or large farmers, and so on. In other words, they don't actually fall into the category of employed and and other activities, so they are excluded. So how do we understand class if we exclude a large proportion of economically active women? And I'm not, and of course, the assumption is that we do think that reproductive work counts as work. And so do individual class categories offer more information? So what we end up doing is then set aside the household class category for, we set aside household class category, and we actually look at individual class category. And I have some notes on what all of these tables mean. So bear with me, and you can ignore the table if you would like. But in addition to the 6 employment and related activities based class categories, we also include 2 other categories which have been used by the NSSO. And for those of you who are familiar with NSSO data, those are activity codes 92 and 93. Activity code 92 classifies people, particularly women, as engaged in domestic activities only. And Activity Code 93 classifies people as being engaged whose principal occupation is considered to be domestic and allied. So whereas in the NSSO doesn't have a very clear definition of what they consider domestic and allied, and we're not going to get into that at this moment, but happy to discuss it in the Q&A. But in any case, domestic and allied also includes a lot of, what would be considered as productive, if at all. There is a distinction between productive and reproductive work. What would be considered also as productive work, which includes, subsistence production and so on, whereas domestic only it includes all of the work that happens within, or which is typically considered as reproductive work, which is all of the cooking and cleaning and caring for individuals in the household and so on. So I want you to, I want to kind of highlight some aspects in this table. So if you look at the highlighted region, one of the things that we wanted to bring up is that even for those, so this table gives you the share of activity in employment and related activities for all of these class categories. And what we find is that even for men who are engaged in employment, first, not all of their work time is engaged in employment-related work. And particularly for non-agricultural wage workers and small farmers, the proportion is not, it is greater than 50, but it's not, it's only 65% in total, right? So 65% of small farmers, or only 65% of total work time for small farmers is engaged in employment-related activities, and for non-ag wage workers, it's 57%. And this sort of talks about, sort of the underemployment, perhaps the lack of adequate jobs and so on. But in any case, there is a fair proportion of men workers or male workers who are engaged in activities outside of employment. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that this, of course, differs by caste, and the caste, we've taken the sort of conventional categories of Adivasis, Dalit, OBC, and others. The other thing that I wanted to point out was also that the same applies for women as well, and that even among salaried women, the highest proportion spent is 54%, and which means that a very large proportion of women's time is taken up by other activities. And again, this varies by caste. And again, if you look at women, small farmers and non-ag wage workers, like I said, it varies by caste. They end up spending a very low proportion of their time on employment-related activities, and presumably other activities become important. So just across castes, among the rural elite, women from Savarna castes and others allocate the lowest share, and by Savarna caste, I mean the castes that are categorized as others, and does not include the Dalit, OBC, and Adivasis. And among non-ag producers and small farmers, women from these castes classified as others allocate the highest share of time to employment. So very quickly, similar thing for own goods production, share of activity, share of total time spent in own goods production. What we find is that for both men and women, small farmers and non-agricultural wage workers spend the highest share of time on own goods production, right? So if we think about male workers who ended up spending only 65% of their time and 57% of their time in employment, we end up finding that a fair amount is spent in own goods production. And we also find that there is that Adivasi men and women end up spending a higher share of time on own goods production, followed by Dalit and OBC, people from Dalit and OBC, or categorized under Dalit and OBC castes. For share of time spent in that women spend a higher share of time on unpaid domestic work, but women of Savarna caste, or classified as others, spend a higher proportion of time on unpaid domestic work, followed by Dalit women. So in other words, the actual proportion varies by caste and class. And then the thing that we found sort of interesting about unpaid domestic work was that when you look at the actual participation rate, which says, what proportion of the women and what proportion of men actually participate in this work. For women, it's very high. It's above 90% across class and across caste. But that there is this difference when you look at the actual share of total time spent in this work, which was interesting. The other interesting aspect of looking at share of total time was unpaid care work, which turns out that it's rather low across classes and castes, even though women end up spending a lot more time on unpaid care work. And really, one of the ways in which perhaps the global south, or at least India, seems to be different from or at least in terms of the literature, in the global north, a lot of the literature tends to be focused on childcare, or not focused, but there's a lot of literature on childcare and elder care, and you don't really see that emerging from this time use data. And of course, we want that to be true. We want people to get the kind of care that they need and require. But from a political perspective, perhaps this might not be the the pressing issue to organize or politically organize people over. So sort of in kind of to summarize some of the results, women expend a higher share of work time to reproductive labor, but we find that even men also spend a fair amount of time in reproductive activities, and this is typically ignored in official statistics. And that among men and women in different caste groups, there are differences in participation rates and shares, and that appear to be multiple, if at all we talk about those 4 activities as livelihood activities, that not just that within a household there might be individuals engaged in different activities, but even individuals themselves might be engaged in multiple activities, and that's significant. So how do we understand this? And we draw from Mary John's work, who talks about labor as a site of contradiction. And one of the things that we kind of infer from this time use survey is that these diversified livelihoods, like I mentioned, exist not just within a household, but also for an individual. And the Indian Time Use Survey allows us to see, to some degree, the extent of this diversification at the national level in a way that wasn't possible with just NSSO data. And that there are contradictions between gendered labors of production and reproduction. And this is to be taken in the context of, all of the, dispossession and dislocation and all of the failures of the of state provisioning that we are experiencing in India. And that these caste differences kind of perhaps give, or are consistent with, the stigma theory of value, or this tension between the stigma theory of value that stigmatizes certain kinds of work for certain kinds of people, and the labor theory of value, where public labor is stigmatized in a way that's related to caste relations. So whereas salaried work may be something that people or women might participate in, other forms of work, women might want to withdraw, particularly to engage or particularly to kind of be consistent with an aspiration for a higher class/caste status. And, at least to some degree, the Indian Time Use Survey sort of allows for or is consistent with that story. So, this conventional definition of work, which excludes reproduction, also then doesn't allow us to see the contradiction of class. So as much as, because we think of production and reproduction as both being part of social reproduction, or reproductive labor and productive labor is both being essential and integral and intertwined in this, in the process of social reproduction. By excluding reproductive labors, we also don't see the contradiction of class, which is also a contradiction of gender and caste. In other words, social reproduction itself becomes the site in which all of these contradictions are sort of co-constituted. So, and to some degree, the Indian Time Use survey allows us for investigating some of these contradictions. And it also then allows for, kind of in what ways can the working people come together, and or in what ways are, what are the points of commonality, or what, in what ways can they organize over? And one of the ways in which they can organize over is the crisis, not just of, and different people have talked about, crisis of care, etc. But, the crisis of social reproduction that's particularly kind of concentrated in the group of people that Isa Shivji refers to as the working people. So I'll end there, and I'm sorry, and
Thank you so much, Dr. Naidu. I'm just seeing if there are any questions. So in case anybody has a question, please feel free to add it in the chat box or raise your hand.
I think Dina's hand is up. Yeah, go ahead, Dina.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Very, very interesting. Of course, there's a lot to take in terms of figures and so on. So firstly, my comment really relates to your discussion on class, which, and some of the comments, generalizations you made about, both the way you measure it and that it's not gendered. So firstly, at the household level, and I think it's important, you will agree, to distinguish between a household's class status and a woman's class status, but I'm not persuaded that the way you do it is, I'm not quite sure how you're doing it, because at the household level, there is a huge amount of literature. And the first one which comes to mind, of course, is Utsa Patnaik's Leninist categories of class. I don't know if you recall her work, where it's really about whether a household hires in labor or hires out labor. And so she uses the standard Leninist categories, applies them to Indian data sets, and then discusses class in a very interesting way. So at least it's very important to recognize that there is that body of work. The second is that, I interrogated the idea of class based on, for instance, the household property status. And that also interrogates in a way Engels' understanding of class, that a person married into a rich household the woman married in rich household is part of the bourgeoisie, and if you're not, you're the proletariat. And my point of interrogation is whether the woman herself owns property, especially landed property. So I think, again, one can't simply assume that there is no discussion around that. It's actually a very substantial discussion. And there's a lot of empirical information to show that if women owned assets, it would make a difference to a range of things, the whole bargaining framework, including their ability to negotiate intra-household labor allocations. The third and related is that even in the standard assumption, I was curious why you took 6 acres as a large farmer. Because, if you look at the agricultural census and all the literature, and including the FAO literature, you normally take, so it's 2 hectares, which is 5 acres, as the small farmer, small and then below that marginal. And then you move to semi-medium, and then the large farmer really goes into for, quite large. I think it's about 10 hectares and 25 acres. So 6 kind of just, it's something that looks like, okay, you've just arrived at that and it doesn't tally with, so you'll have problems with 6, even in terms of trying to, overlap yours with other definitions which have existed for several decades. If you want to compare it with the agricultural census data or NSS's data, then 6 wouldn't really serve your purpose very well. And then your labor, and therefore your analysis would I think is so dependent on those categories, or where you draw the lines. And if you don't mind, one final thing, and this is just an economist fixation, that, we talk about household fixed effects, so if you, of course, you're not doing any of that, but if you have 3 women in the same household, how do you actually control for that?
Yes.
In the way you've talked about it, age will matter. And in the anthropological literature, daughters-in-law, the relationships will matter, and so on. So, those are my comments. Thank you. And questions, if you like. Yeah.
Do you want me to take them now, answer now, or take some more questions?
Sure. We can do, we can answer per question. So if you have any response, we can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Beena. Absolutely. And yes, and familiar with, very, very familiar with your work, from since I was, very familiar with your work, but also with, Utsa Patnaik's work, and agree that, household property status does, or rather property status does matter. We, in terms of class, and this probably answers both your question on, why take class in that way, and then, why the land categories. We are following we didn't come up with those categories. We are following, like I said, like I mentioned, Vamsi Bakulabaranam's work, who also draws from, Patnaik and so on, and, is trying to kind of, trying to think about class categories, not just in the context of property, but, kind of trying to perhaps also incorporate all of these different ways in which, like, how do we understand class, right? And so, for instance, Jairus Banerjee has talked, and he kind of attributes it to, or his discussion following from Bernstein, Henry Bernstein's Classes of Labor, right? And he talks about these different forms of, or distinct forms of exploitation, even among, what we end up calling classes of labor. And so just sort of an attempt to try and get to class from a labor perspective as opposed to a property perspective, in order to take into account some of the complexities that exist, whereby even someone with property could end up in, different kinds of, and that's where perhaps the multiple livelihoods aspect becomes sort of relevant, where you might have property and yet you might be engaged in various kinds of activities. But your point is very valid, and I, in the paper, we do discuss, or discuss some of these kind of conversations. But essentially, especially because we have access to the time use literature, we wanted to see if we could get to class based on the effort, right? Like the time or the laboring aspect of it, as opposed to only the property aspect of it. The land categories, similarly, again, drawing from Vamsi's work, but also what we found was that, above 6 acres, that it didn't really, the proportion of households was fairly small. So it didn't seem to, but we could do some kind of sensitivity analysis to see, how it differs. And you're right that we might want to add something in the paper so that it becomes sort of comparable to sort of already existing studies, and the ways in which they have used that. with respect to your comment on the fact that age matters and the number of women in the household, absolutely. And this is where, both Smriti and I, we've done other work where we've kind of struggled with NSSO data. We've struggled with, doing econometric work because we didn't have, NSSO doesn't offer as much information. And we were talking even with respect to this work that it would be so easy to just run an econometric regression to control for some of these variables, like you mentioned, age, number of women in the household, and so on. We did, I did mention that as a caveat, that we don't actually take into account those very important aspects, which is that, what is the intergenerational aspect within a household, and what is, the spatial aspect, which also I think, would matter. But you're absolutely right. Those are very important, and those are things that we haven't addressed in this paper, but do want to bring that in a very significant way in the next paper that we plan to work on. Really talking about, how do we, because, what we ended up doing was moving to an individual notion. And so we left it at that, but you're absolutely right. How do we understand individual work if you don't understand it, again, back in the household context? And so that's perhaps some of the tension between moving from individual to household, and how do you locate, both in a cohesive way. But again, I couldn't disagree with you at all, Beena. And thank you for your comments and questions.
There's one more question. This is from Shraddha Jain. She's saying that she's also explored this data and that the time spent on unpaid care is very low. She's mentioned that the proportion of households reporting any time spent on unpaid care is less, even those with children.
Yes.
And she's asking if you have any thoughts on the same.
Yes, and like I said, we were very, very surprised by that. Or perhaps it's not very surprising. You could look at it at either ways, right? I mean, it's surprising because so much so much literature has been devoted, at least in the global north, to care work, right? Unpaid care work, and care work more narrowly defined as childcare, elder care, caring, for other individuals, etc. And you don't see that in the Indian context. And it could also be perhaps kind of a care deficit. It could also be that, culturally, or maybe it's an economic variable where women do not end up spending as much time on, childcare in the same way they do in maybe upper income households, or perhaps in the global north. Yes, so yeah, absolutely. I think it's very interesting, and sort of interesting to see. You kind of know this anecdotally, but to actually see that in terms of data.
Right. I can see a raised hand from Beena. Is that an old hand?
Well, if there is time, I'll come back, but I don't want to use up her time because there'll be others.
Sure. Okay. Okay. There's another hand from Jayanti Lingam. Please go ahead.
Hi, Surisha. Good to see you again. From IAFI.
Yes.
Thank you very, very much for your presentation, and sorry about my camera not showing me properly. I'm not an economist, as you know, so I'm apologies in advance for the fact that this isn't going to be worded in an economic way. But I wanted to bring up the question that I think I raised at IAFI, actually, which was about within those definitions in the time use survey, the unpaid work still excludes work that wouldn't be domestic, that is community type work. And I think the reason I wanted to bring it up was because at IAFI, I think you said that in your paper, you had thought about this and thought the best way it could be defined is as voluntary work. And having thought it through, and also looking at the research project I'm doing now, which is actually how COVID has impacted BAME communities in the UK, I think that there are issues of class and gender that come with defining it as voluntary work still. So to me, when we talk about voluntary work, that is perhaps something that isn't so fundamental to your social reproduction. Whereas I'm not sure I'm articulating this very well. The kind of work that I'm thinking of, if we're talking about global south, say in Sri Lanka, it might be women who have land, have to negotiate with an occupying army to get the land back for the village. Or in the UK, it might be women who are trying to get community members involved in social activities so that the community can be more cohesive, not because they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart as voluntary work, but because they have to do that for the community, for their children, for their kin, to survive in that community in the aftermath of COVID and the absence of the state. And so I wondered, I think that's something I think there are class and caste and gender issues, because it always seems to be women doing that. Yes. And I wondered how, or whether you've given any more thought as to how that gets defined.
Yeah, thank you, Jayanti. Actually, after your comment at IAFI, we actually went back and looked at the data. So to some degree, we're constrained by the way this work is defined in the time use survey, right? And this is again becomes one of the points, the sticking points, right? Like how much do you rely on secondary data and how much do you actually go out and collect the data in the form that you want to use. And so we did actually look at community work and what is classified as community work and voluntary work, and we found that it's very insignificant, right? But it doesn't, I think, negate the question and the comment that you're making. I think all it says is that the time use survey has perhaps not been able to capture that, right? And partly it could be one that this kind, that kind of work that's important might vary significantly across regions and across communities, and hence, in the aggregate, the time use survey is unable to capture that. But also the other criticism, that has been levied against the time use, or is that, like, how do you kind of separate out, right? How do you separate out some of this work, right? So if you think about women who might, let's say, help their neighbor and are also talking, like, does that show up as separately as help? Or does that show up as kind of leisure activity, or, you're engaging in social activities, right? So how do we understand the, do the definitions that the time use survey or the definitions that the time use survey is used, is that consistent with perhaps, or does it fully capture all of the effort, right? Or the work or the time that has been spent on things that are not easily classified, and people may not actually think of them as work the way that we normally talk about work in sort of regular discourse. But I think it's still a very valid point. We just weren't able to uncover anything, and so we decided to not pursue that for the moment. Smriti and I have another paper with some other folks where we actually look at time use data based on work that, or field work. And in that, we're exploring some of this aspect that you mentioned, Jayanti. Like, how do we think about perhaps societal reproduction, or how do we think about, community work, etc. So thanks for that question.
If we don't do that, then we will just have to open up the seams.
Yeah.
So you want us to open up the seams?
No.
Hello. Hi, I think mute yourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I had one if there's nobody else.
Right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Shrisha, there's one thing you can actually do, because what is very important is region. So you can, it doesn't matter whether you're a Dalit woman or you're really landless labor. If you're based in Haryana, the infrastructure is very well developed. There's pipe drinking water. You're in a completely different position or in Kerala, compared to, let's say, if you're in Manipur or somewhere else. So that really must be factored in. Now you could, I would suggest that you actually look at other data sets, because there's plenty of information, macro level across India on infrastructure, on availability of drinking water, on even clean natural gas, so you don't have to get firewood and fodder, and firewood in particular. And your mapping, your analysis might look quite different. Your class will also look very different. If you take Kerala, a small irrigated plot of this would be on average 0.35 cents, and that farmer can subsist because it's rich agricultural land, yet you've got 3 crops. So I think this, you're saying, well, I will do it in another paper, but in a sense, your current paper really requires, I feel, much more insights into what you're presenting. In a sense, and demographics will vary regionally. So you'll have two person, one child families in Kerala, one woman, one child. You may have in UP, it'll be quite different.
Sure.
So this conundrum of how many women do you have in the family, and do you treat them each as individuals, will also vary. So some kind of weighting, some effort on that would actually could give you interesting, and I think important consistent empirical results.
Okay.
There's one more question in the chat. This is from Solvik. I think, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. So they have said that could it also be that women undercount their work, take the childcare, keeping an eye for them granted, and especially if it's a simultaneous activity. So don't know how the Time Use survey dealt with that, or what direction it gave to those filling in the survey.
And I think there's another hand up, and I don't know if you want, I don't know when you have to close, but you want to take that question. I can answer both.
Sure, yeah. Parvati, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, first apologies. Okay, so the thing I wanted to ask is, I've been really sort of thinking about this relationship between care and social reproduction, and when do we call something as work? When do we not call it as work? When do we actually make something into a unit, and what do we take for granted as our responsibility, and therefore not narratable? And I just, it's something which has been kind of exercising me, because I did a short piece recently for around the Care Manifesto book, which came out, as did Prabha, and both of us talked about the fact that they talk about care rather than social reproduction. But to me, there's something else as well which is going on, which is that we are sometimes, so it's this question about what is narratable as work. When do we self-actualize something as an activity rather than taking that as something that is just part of our lives and therefore not narratable? And I really, welcome the thoughts, your thoughts, but also the thoughts of, so many people here in the group who have done such fantastic work on this, on what, what your sense of this is. To me, it felt like you almost need to have a sense of entitlement to actually even think of it as work. Otherwise, you just think, well, you're a woman, you have to do it, so you don't narrate it as work. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. And I think it's also, relates to the other question about, multiple activities and do people undercount. So the thing with the time use survey is that it's not asking you what you think of as work, right? But just what you're doing. And then, and so then, if you may not think of it as, you may not think of taking care of your child as work, but that's, still shows up in the time use survey. And then, the question is, what do you end up doing with it, right? So in terms of multiple activities, the time use survey, the Indian time use survey counts up to 3 activities. And one can criticize that, like why not all activities, perhaps. And the way that it currently does it is that it kind of sequentializes it. So if people spend 30 minutes on 2 activities, then I mean, if you know, within a 30-minute framework, if there are 2 activities listed, they get 15 minutes each. And we want to play around with that as well, a little bit. And then Parvati, to answer your question, and I think that's a very, very, you know, kind of, you know, I think that's, you know, part of like how we understand, you know, or rather like part of a larger kind of discussion that, you know, I've been having with multiple sort of, you know, colleagues and co-authors, and I'm sure people are having it elsewhere as well, because you said that perhaps counting something as work is, you know, a matter of privilege, and, you know, could be, and then perhaps there are, you know, maybe not counting something as work could also be a matter of, you know, privilege. And I think that here sort of the literature on caste begins to kind of play a role. And, you know, of course, among, you know, within the Indian context, there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, paid work, or you know, paid work, and, you know, whether that counts as, you know, is that desirable, undesirable? And, you know, there are people in this audience who have, you know, participated in debates, etc. But it also relates to caste, right? So what kind of work is considered work, and what kind of work is not considered work, and what kind of work is considered desirable, and what kind of work is undesirable. And I, at least my sense is that perhaps we may need to kind of evolve our language, and there is, of course, work on, you know, affective labor and emotional labor, and, you know, does that count as work or not? And you know, in a recent edited collection, Samita Sen goes over some of those, you know, conversations. And I, you know, in terms of social reproduction, and that's why I kept kind of reverting to energy or effort. I sort of think about it as energy or effort. As economists, we often think about work as a disutility, right? As something undesirable. And yet, for some people, that might be something that they want to participate in, and that's what you mean by, I think you mean by self-actualization. But it is effort nevertheless. And it is effort and energy expended on activities that need to be counted, because they do allow for, you know, under capitalism, they allow for maybe just survival. You know, if you're privileged, or if you're, you know, kind of somehow, you know, not subject to sort of the, you know, subject to extreme exploitation, etc., it might become something enjoyable. But it's still effort that leads to, you know, social reproduction, and it's important for us, irrespective of whether we call it work or not. But I appreciate that question and love to hear from others, you know, how and what conversations they have been having on that question. Of course, ma'am.
Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts?
I just, Sirisha, whether you could say a little bit more about the stigma theory of value. I know you've already alluded to it just now in your response, but if you could just unpack it a little more, and the contradictions.
Right. I mean, so the, you know, the labor theory of value being that, you know, value is created by labor. And so if you labor, you are not just creating value, but you are engaged in productive work. You're a productive member of society, as opposed to a stigma theory of value, which, you know, sort of is derives from notions of caste, where at least certain kinds of labor and certain kinds of laboring and certain kinds of work. And I'm sorry that I'm kind of using those terms interchangeably. I know that people have written about how work is different from labor, but, you know, that they become, or they are associated with stigma. You know, so if you are perhaps, you know, like, you know, for instance, certain kinds of domestic work are not, you know, something that a woman of an upper, you know, of a so-called upper caste would take up. So, for instance, cleaning, you know, I'm talking about paid domestic work, cleaning the bathroom. has a particular stigma associated with it, which is related to caste. And part of the discussion in the Indian context has been that, do people withdraw, because of that, right? Like, if, do you withdraw because of the stigma of certain kinds of paid labor because it's associated with certain castes? And similarly, would women of certain castes not participate in paid labor because there is a stigma associated with laboring bodies, and we know that to be the case in India, right? Labor is not considered in any positive light, and laboring bodies are not considered in any positive light. So there is that kind of tension between, who participates in paid work and who doesn't. And perhaps even in the, domestic space or domestic sphere, who participates in even unpaid, the realm of domestic work, is some of it outsourced to women of lower castes and lower classes because of the stigma associated with laboring.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Janti, is that a old hand or do you have a new question? Oh, okay.
Sorry, it was an old hand. Sorry.
That's fine. Does anybody else have any questions or thoughts? Okay, so I think now I think we can wrap up this conversation, and thank you so much, Dr. Naidu, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And yeah, I do look forward to the papers that you have mentioned, and I look forward to reading them.
Okay.
So
Thank you very much. And
yeah.
thank you, Prabha, for the invitation.
Is there some place we can read the paper in its form, or we can, of course, wait for it to be published as well?
Well, I'll send it across once once it's ready. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.